What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the Laugh to Learn podcast, your weekly source for a fun spin on all the goings-on in the world. My name is, as it remains, Jacob Paveo, and I come to you each and every Wednesday afternoon, 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, fresh for you to download. You can listen to it all over the world, anywhere you choose. We have listeners from Russia to Europe to Australia. There's a few listeners out in Australia. Over time, there have been listeners throughout Africa, like in Central Africa. I've seen some downloads pop up. So either someone is using a strange VPN, or there's someone in Central Africa with a lot of time on their hands to come across my podcast. But either way, each and every one of you are, of course, welcome to the show. I come to you from the Great White North each and every Wednesday, as I already mentioned. And yeah, this week, it's just absolutely crazy. I have to talk about this. I mean, there's a Canadian election coming up, so that's like the side story. And when I'm telling you that an election, I can't even speak, an election here in my own nation is the side story that I'm not even going to discuss this week, that means there's obviously something big for us to talk about. And of course, if you've been following my social media posts, you probably already know what's going on. If you exist, really, if you have access to the news or any social media channel, you will have seen that in the course of about 2 weeks, really it comes down to like 3 days, the Taliban have essentially swept through and they have taken over complete control of Afghanistan once more, for the first time since 2001. And that's what we've got to talk about today. So I'm not going to waste any more time. I guess I should say that if it's your first time listening to the show, welcome. I am assuming that this show is going to attract a few more ears, so thank you so much for checking it out. I hope you enjoy it. If it's your first time back, maybe you haven't listened to the podcast in a little while, thanks for checking it out once again. I hope you will hit that subscribe button wherever you happen to be listening. And, you know, I'm always here for you each and every Tuesday. So, yeah, thank you guys so much. You already know where you are because you clicked the link. This is the Laugh to Learn podcast. Hey, check it out. It's the Laugh to Learn podcast. Listeners of the show will probably know that the podcast is generally scripted. I typically like to sit down and spend a good 3 or 4 hours going through everything. I write a script, and I pretty much stick to it. There may be, here and there, 1 or 2 things that I'll change, as I go through recording it. But for the most part, it is scripted, and yeah, and that's how I generally do this podcast. But this episode, I sat down this weekend when I normally do, collecting my thoughts and my research. It was still early on, and so the Canadian election hadn't been announced yet. We didn't know what was going to happen in Afghanistan, and I basically wrote a podcast about the potential for a Canadian election to be called. Then all of this stuff happened where the election was actually called. It's funny because I was literally on Saturday talking with someone about because he was saying that he thinks the election would be called within the next week, and sure enough, he was right. So I was just talking about that on Monday. That's why I had the idea to write the episode about the potential for an election to be called, because, I mean, everyone's been discussing it. we all knew that an election would probably be called before another wave of COVID. And it actually, when he brought it up to me, I was like, yeah, you're right. This actually seems like an ideal time. So I wrote that episode. Then the election was actually called, so I thought, okay, I got to edit it a bit. And then the Taliban took over Afghanistan. So all of a sudden, everything changed. And I thought about sitting down and writing out a full episode on this. But to be completely honest with you, I know exactly how I feel about this. I know exactly what I want to say about it. And there was really no need for me to script an episode because I know exactly how this is going to go. So let's jump right into it. So for those of you who maybe you've seen Afghanistan flags being posted on social media and people, claiming their support for the Afghan citizens who are impacted by this, and you may have also heard about Afghan citizens who have been helping with allied nations, even non-allied nations like Russia and China, who have now had their lives put at risk because these citizens of Afghanistan who may have worked in an embassy as a translator or a security guard or an administrator, anything, their lives are now in grave danger because the last time the Taliban took over, these were the people they killed first. And throughout time, anytime they captured an Afghan citizen, or not even necessarily an Afghan citizen, but any person who was working with any other nation other than themselves, they were put to death in obviously the horrendous ways that we don't even need to get into. We all know what they did back in the day, what they're now doing again, and what similar groups such as they like to do on video. So I was going to make a joke about how we talk about weird shit on video and then they post that shit and it's unquestioned, but I'm not going to make that joke. Basically, if you're unaware of what happened, last year, Donald Trump made an agreement to have, by May 5th, all American troops pulled out of Afghanistan, and the agreement was that the Taliban were not going to attack as they were withdrawing. So there are about 300 outposts, military outposts is roughly the number that I saw being used. No one, obviously, it's more like secret information, obviously, so we don't exactly know how many there were, but there are roughly 300 military outposts across Afghanistan, and they were run by the Afghan military, which is about 300 members strong, and they were, along with the American support, typically the Americans were only providing air support and special missions that were outside of the general realm of things. Because we all know that the U.S., Canada, England, France, all of these allied nations go into these countries and kill people all the time. They just don't talk about it. And they kill high-profile targets, right? And then you'll hear oh, so-and-so died, R.I.P., you know what I mean? And everyone kind of knows what happened, but no one talks about it. So that sort of thing is constantly going on. But Donald Trump's agreement was that the main support of the American military, they had a few thousand troops, I think it's 3,000, who were in Afghanistan helping the Afghan military, which, as I said, was 300,000 members strong. And Trump signed an agreement to pull out. The Taliban leaders agreed not to attack the American troops, and Trump had agreed they would be gone by May 5th. Biden went over this agreement and determined that rather than May 5th, he would use September 11th, because he's a moron, and for some reason he's we have to use a substantial day. So he picked September 11th to be the day the Americans pulled out. The Taliban were upset by that and said, if you go beyond May 5th, we may not hold to our agreement. So obviously, this podcast is going live on August 18th, but as of August 16th, Monday, August 16th, the last of the Allied troops were flown out of the country. And, chaos has since ensued, as you can obviously imagine. Now, the biggest question that I had when I went over all this was like, wait a minute. So there were 3,000 American troops and 300,000 Afghan military personnel and 75,000 active members of the Taliban. How does that work? How did they take over? It's actually quite simple. As I said, there were 300 military outposts across the country. And these outposts, Afghanistan is a large desert, mountainous country. It's very difficult to supply these places without air support. So anyone listening, or I shouldn't say anyone listening, but most people listening are Canadian, American, Australian, and if not, if you're from Europe, think of Europe as a whole, right? Combine all of the countries together. Now spread 300 military bases across that region, right? 300 bases across the U.S., across Canada, across Europe, across Australia. I know Afghanistan's not that big, but it's a big place. It's desert and remote. And now pull air support and try to get food, try to get water, try to get ammunition, supplies, information to these 300 outposts. Even with 300,000 members of your armed forces, you can't do it without air support. So the U.S. left behind a few airplanes, and obviously the Taliban targeted that first. They took over the airport that the planes were housed in, and there's I think 10 planes and a few helicopters and stuff like that they took over. And now the Afghan military has absolutely no way of resupplying any of their troops across the country. So the Taliban just walk up to the door. And what are you going to do? You know you have no food coming. You know you have no water coming. You know you have no ammunitions coming. And the Taliban, although there's only 75,000 of them, as every single person knows, their cave systems and their supply systems are much like that of the Mexican cartel, where they can move stuff throughout the country, for the most part, underground, where no one can detect them, flawlessly, easily. They can resupply the entire country, or the entire region that they occupy at least, without any concern, because the military's not even going to see them doing it, right? And ultimately, that's why the country fell so quickly. The American forces came in and trained the Taliban in a method of a military method, which is very modern. Same thing that we here in Canada, all basically, if you're listening to this, you're probably from a more developed country that has a sophisticated air force, right? And I mean, you don't need to be as sophisticated as the U.S. or the Russian or Chinese, English Air Force, you know what I mean? Even, Canadian, French air forces, it doesn't have to be that sophisticated, right? There are a lot of South American countries with small air forces that can supply these areas. Afghanistan doesn't have that. Their military doesn't have that capacity, because the country's been destroyed and torn up, and there's no money, and it's very difficult, right? So the U.S. provided them with a small fleet of planes, which, I mean, as everyone knows, one of these planes costs tens of millions of dollars. And I mean, to the U.S., it's really nothing, because as we've discussed on this podcast before, the U.S. actually oversupplies military assets, being planes and ships and stuff that they're never going to use, mostly aircraft and land vehicles. So it doesn't really cost them, because they're just sitting there and they're going to be scrapped and made into another thing later anyways. It doesn't really cost them, but it still costs them. They still delivered these vehicles to them that are now in Taliban hands. And yeah, I mean, that's why they fell so quickly. The military was trained by the U.S. and by allied forces, not just the U.S., but allied forces, and they were trained in a modern military style that did not rely on ground support. And when ground support was really the only option they were left with, everything fell apart. Almost instantly, in a matter of weeks, really in a matter of days, it completely fell apart. And as of now, the Taliban have full control of Kabul, which is the capital of Afghanistan. The capital city is theirs. Most of the small regions they control. The predictions, if you look at, it's almost like an election map. It's kind of eerie. But if you look at the predictions, there's like 3 small regions in, I think it was southeastern Afghanistan, which they think the people there may reject the Taliban, and they may be able to fight them off and kind of have their own thing going. But nothing, like, they essentially now control the country. So other than the obvious, like, what the hell are we doing here? How did we get here from 2001 when they invaded Afghanistan? Albeit the invasion of Afghanistan, we're not going to go over it again. Obviously, it should not have happened in the first place, because, of course, the Taliban had nothing to do with 9/11, which is why it was so weird that Biden chose 9/11 to be the day that American troops were going to be pulled out. Of course, Al-Qaeda was responsible for 9/11, but they thought that the Taliban had, or Afghanistan specifically, because then they were recognized as the Afghani government, had weapons of mass destruction. Of course, they didn't. Iran was the same thing. The whole mess, right, around the second invasion of the Middle East after Desert Storm. The War on Terror, I think, is what we're going with, the name for this war. But either way, you know what I'm talking about. Probably shouldn't have invaded Afghanistan in the first place, but nonetheless, we're there, and we made all of these changes, and now it's falling apart. So what is the big fallout? Well, honestly, the 3 things that I want to talk about, first of all, are the number of people trying to escape. So the Taliban enforce their strict version, well, in general, Sharia law is typically strict, but a particularly strict version of Sharia law, in which women are viewed as, they would argue, as equals, but in a modern sense, women are treated as second-class citizens. There have been cases I was reading about already where women are required to be with a man to leave the house, and women have been getting in trouble for this already, which is, a mahram, I think is how you pronounce it. It's the idea of women can only leave if they have a man at their side. I'm sure you've heard of this before. If you haven't, this is an absolutely real thing. You need a male guardian to leave the house. Forget about leave. Like, people talk about, like, leaving the country. You need a man to agree. Oh, that's so crazy, and all this stuff you hear in the news. But it's like, no, you literally need a male guardian to leave the house in Taliban-controlled territories. And there have been women getting in trouble for not being accompanied by a male guardian out of the house. Among other things, we've seen people grabbing onto airplanes and falling to their death, attempting to hold onto the wings of a plane to get out of the country. Now, for some reason, liberal social media, and I actually shouldn't even use the term liberal social media because I guess that would include me, but leftist social media is telling people to wait and see. We have to support them. You can't judge them just because of their religion. All this bullshit, which clearly anyone, and I mean, if you're listening to this and you have that mentality, you have to just stop listening to this right now. Turn it off right now. I'm giving you full permission to turn it off and never listen to me again. But what you're going to do is you're going to go and research what these groups have done. Research the Taliban. Research Al-Qaeda. Research Boko Haram across Central Africa and the Congo. Like, these groups literally murder people for no reason. Under our guidance, our rules, like our way of life, no reason. It's like, you're gay, throw them off a building. That woman, she's a whore, meaning, a woman slept with a man out of wedlock, stone her to death. No joke. Like, that is it. That's the rule. That's the way it works. So if you're like defending this as sure, like they use the argument that it is a religious belief, right? Well, how would you react if suddenly the Roman Catholic Church decided to start actually enforcing biblical rule like they did in the Middle Ages, right? Where anyone who is not a Christian, I guess you could argue Christian people would be okay because they believe in Jesus Christ. But I mean, clearly not, because the Protestants fought heavily against the Catholics. But essentially, if you don't believe exactly what we believe, then we have every authority to kill you. And that's literally written in the Bible if you take it literally, right? And so because these people take their book literally, for some reason, people go, oh, well, it's just their religion. It's just their belief. So just don't live there and it'll be fine. Like, no, we have to defend these people who are all Muslims being killed by them. I shouldn't say all Muslims, because, of course, there are minority religions in the area that are also at risk. But there are a lot of people who are just, Muslims living their life that happen to live in Afghanistan. They happen to be born there. And they don't think that, a woman should be stoned to death for having sex out of wedlock. They don't think, or for being raped, which is another thing. Literally, if a woman is raped, it's her fault and she's stoned to death. They don't think that you should be throwing gay people off of buildings. They just happen to live there. We need to defend those people because they can't defend themselves. Which brings me to the first scenario that I want to talk about, which is the Afghanistan professional women, not professional, but their national women's soccer team. So the former leader of the team, she retired a few years ago, but she was their captain and really brought female soccer up and made it a relevant thing in Afghanistan. Of course, they've competed in national tournaments like the World Cup. Her name is Khalida Popal. And she has been sort of the leader of this movement of female soccer players from Afghanistan. And she has been interviewed recently by the Associated Press. I'm not going to go through her whole interview. You can read it if you'd like. It's actually like kind of disturbing, some of the stuff that she talks about. But she's been taking phone calls from all sorts of girls who are on the team. She is living in Denmark. She had to seek asylum in Denmark because she was getting her life threatened simply because the women's soccer team helped push a movement forward to allow women to work, allow women to get educated and go to school, and they were sort of viewed as the image, the face of this movement. The women's soccer team was viewed as. Well, now she has had contact with every girl that she can on the team who is currently in Afghanistan and told them, delete all of your social media, pretend you were never on the team, find a man and make him your husband right away and just blend into society, pretend you were nothing, pretend this was never a thing. And she's obviously very distraught having to tell all of these young women that the Afghan soccer team, the women's soccer team, is done. She did mention that she has spoken with some representatives of FIFA, and there's nothing anyone can do. Like, obviously the Taliban is not going to allow a women's soccer team to continue, and so they were relatively a new team. They're ranked near the bottom, 152nd out of 167 women's national teams. But, they're afraid that because the Taliban is everywhere, they're spreading fear throughout the country and specifically targeting women right now. She mentions that they're desperate. They have no idea what's going on, and they're all afraid of coming out and asking any questions about the existence of the soccer team. So instead, they've actually grouped together and decided that they're all going to pretend the team doesn't exist. So think about that. These women, none of them are professional soccer players, right? They're not quite at that level, but they are the highest level of female soccer in Afghanistan, which is, I mean, a fantastic achievement. Like, I can't say anything like that. I'm not the the top male podcaster of any of my city, let alone the country. You know what I mean? Like, you can't. It's fantastic achievements that these women have made in their lives and dedicated their lives to something where they know they're not going to make money from it, but they were doing it just so that they can influence young girls to follow in their footsteps, play sports, join soccer, play sports with boys specifically and against boys, and to not be afraid to do so. And then ultimately they were hoping to achieve success down the road with the women's national team, and maybe actually place in some tournaments and whatnot. And all of a sudden, everything that they've been working for the last 10 years, if not longer, right? I mean, their whole lives probably they've been playing soccer, but the last 10 years where they've actually had the opportunity to qualify for this national team and everything, suddenly it's over. It's done because this group who is now leading the country says, no, women can't do that. And suddenly they can't. And not only that, but they're going to target anyone, likely at least. They will start targeting anyone who were, flag bearers, messengers that women can succeed and women can actually play sports and women can do great things in life. These are things that groups like the Taliban fear. They're afraid, clearly, of losing any sorts of power. They're afraid of women realizing that they aren't just feeble-minded child bearers, right? Which is what, if you read a book from 2,000 years ago, that's literally what women were. That's what they did. Everyone was living to be 30 years old, right? So in that time, women really only had like 15 years where they had any chance of having kids, and so they had as many as they could, and then they died. Women were just people who lived at home and gave birth and then died, and men couldn't give birth, so they went to work and then died at, 28, 29, 30 years old. Like, this is just the reality of that time period where these books were written. And for some reason, some people just accept that a group nowadays in 2021 still thinks like that, and that we should for some reason respect that opinion. That's literally like flat earth. You expect me to sit here and respect someone's opinion that the earth is flat? No. It's just like I don't respect someone's opinion that a woman should be chaperoned around the village with a man, and I don't respect someone's opinion that a woman should be forced to wear hijab or burqa, which is even worse. I don't respect your opinion that women should be forced to do anything. I don't respect that opinion at all. I don't respect that religious perspective. And if you argue that that is your religion, then I don't respect your religion. And I don't understand why people have a problem coming out and saying that. I simply don't understand it. I can't grasp it. And I never will. I will never understand it. I've tried. I've really tried to understand that. And that's not saying that I don't respect the Muslim faith. It's saying I do not respect that perspective on the faith, that conclusion derived from their interpretation of religious text. I don't respect it. Lastly, the thing that I want to discuss is the Afghanistan all-girls robotics team has actually made a plea, and they want to flee the Taliban and come to Canada. So this is a team made up of 25 girls between the ages of 12 and 18 in the Afghan city of Herat. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that right or not. But essentially, they just this past week in their hometown, they were allegedly turned away from the universities by Taliban forces who were standing at the doors and said that now only men can enter. So this team of 25 girls has been in this city, receiving education, and obviously they're a nationally recognized team of roboticists. And I'm assuming they compete in those, like the robot fighting, or I don't know, something cool like that. They build things. But they're now no longer allowed to be educated because the Taliban said that women shouldn't be educated. So this group of 25 girls is asking to come to Canada. Quote, this is from the CTV News. It's all about protecting them moving forward and making sure they're in a place where they still have the freedom they deserve, the freedom to be educated, the freedom of movement, the freedom to health care, end quote. And that's from a North Carolina-based individual who's involved in the female robotics teams from around the world. And this story really caught me because it's so there's very little that we can do, right? Like obviously the militaries are pulled out, so we can't even discuss going back. That doesn't make sense. But there are things that we can do, and I'm now going to read this. This is from Malala Yousafzai, who I'm sure you've heard of. She was the girl who was shot in the head. She was shot like 3 times, including once in the head, by the Taliban in Pakistan because she was speaking out about women and girls deserving an education. As well, she was on her way to school to receive that education when she was attacked on a bus. Since, of course, she's won a Nobel Prize. And she wrote this in the New York Times about these girls asking to come to Canada. She said, quote, "Afghan girls and young women are once again where I have been, in despair over the thought that they might never be allowed to see a classroom or hold a book again. Some members of the Taliban say they will not deny women and girls education or the right to work. But given the Taliban's history of violently suppressing women's rights, Afghan women's fears are real. In this critical moment, we must listen to the voices of Afghan women and girls. They are asking for protection, for education, for the freedom and the future they were promised. We cannot continue to fail them. We have no time to spare." End quote. And Canada has only said that it has no plans to recognize the Taliban as Afghanistan's government, which abso-fucking-lutely not. And let me tell you, if anyone in this election says anything along those lines, we are going to have a conversation about that. That's not going to happen. But I think this is something that the Canadian government should absolutely be doing, is finding a way to get this group of 25 girls here in Canada, between the ages of 15 and 18, by the way. So they are high school age girls who should be brought here and educated, allowed to be educated. And there's really no argument against it. It's literally a group of 25 of the smartest females in the country. Like, you're literally taking girls who are going to be going on to be, engineers and doctors and, scientific-based, probably all engineers, to be perfectly honest with you. And I don't see any problem with offering them, residency here, asylum here, and getting them educated, get them into schools, and allow them to, I went to the University of Ontario, which is now has a different name. It's called OnTech U, and that is a school based entirely around engineering. Our robotics program and the robotics team is world renowned. We have a race car team that is competes at the highest levels of competition, all sorts of things like that. These girls need to have access to programs such as we have and our children have, because they would have otherwise. Had the Taliban not taken over, they would have been able to continue on the national robotics team. They would have been able to continue to be, to become engineers or whatever they wanted to be. They could have gone to school to be anything. They're obviously a group of the smartest young girls in the country. And this is the story as well, where these are the girls who are reporting that in their hometown they have been required to have a male guardian. So they were turned away from school, and they were told to return straight home and only leave their house if they were accompanied by a man. So this is a crazy story. I honestly can say I never thought that I would be discussing a Taliban takeover of a country ever. I mean, ever. It's 2021. They fell 20 years ago. And 75,000 stray members have now claimed control of the country, and they're going to grow in numbers, and they're going to take over that region and maybe try and press their borders outwards. Time will tell. But this is a mess, and this is what happens when you start regime change wars. This is the problem of the United States. They caused this problem. And now, I don't know. I probably would have given the information they were given. If I was in Congress in 2001, I probably would have voted to go to war as well. I probably would have, given all the information, right? And, I mean, most people would have. Most people supported the war for years until we knew that it was all a lie. And honestly, I think what this comes down to is there's never a right answer, but there's often a worse answer, a worse decision to be made. So, was there an opportunity for some middle ground? Did we have to pull out all Allied troops over the course of whatever it was, like 10 months or so? Or was there some sort of middle ground where we could have still provided air support and waited until the Afghan military was able to provide themselves with support to restock these military outposts across the country, to have a government where, like, literally the leader, the prime minister or president, whatever he is, of Afghanistan fled the country. Like, he's gone. He bounced. Could you imagine if Justin Trudeau, like if you know, the Front de Libération Québec, the FLQ, the group that was trying to separate Quebec and take over the government back in the I think it's like the 70s, 80s. I should know the exact year, but I don't remember it right now. If the FLQ showed up and, like, they're taking over Canada, and Trump is like, see you later, he's off to Switzerland. Trudeau was like, I'm off to Switzerland. I would be like, the hell you are? Get your ass back here. Like, if we have to deal with this bullshit, so do you. So I have no respect for this leader of Afghanistan, because, he saw this ship going down and he was the first one on a lifeboat. And now you see his citizens dying in the airport, falling off of planes because they're trying to hang on to them. The image I posted on Instagram earlier. Actually, I think I'm saving it. I'm posting it on. If you look at my Instagram for the podcast, you'll see it. I think it's being posted the morning before the podcast goes live. It's an image of a whole bunch of people seated in an American C-17 aircraft. That's like the giant aircraft carrier. Not aircraft carrier, sorry. The giant airplane that carries like tanks and supplies and stuff. It's like a huge plane stacked with people. And it's so sad to look at. So we've been told, as of right now, 2,200 people have been evacuated from Afghanistan. That's not nearly enough. It's just not. There are so many people that are going to be murdered, assaulted. Women are going to be raped and then killed because they were raped. It's going to be a horrible time for that part of the world. And I feel awful for the individuals who are there. And it makes me feel somewhat worse that as someone sitting here in one of these G7 allied nations, that we probably could have done something better to handle this situation. But once again, by the time I'm talking about it and you guys are talking about it or whatever, it's too late. It's just too late at this point to make the changes, to make the preparations as they should have been. And I feel terrible about that, and I wish things were different. But hopefully, the Taliban is promising to be peaceful and everything. I'm calling bullshit right now. There's no way in hell it's going to be peaceful. They'll probably be peaceful with their neighbors, but they're going to be killing a whole lot of people within the country in the coming weeks and months. Hopefully that's not the case. Hopefully we never really have to talk about it again, and we can just move on with our lives, talk about the Canadian election, and just, move forward. But I have a feeling that's not going to be the case. I hope that it's not, and I hope we can. I hope we can get on without having to cover much about Afghanistan in the future. But only time will tell. Thank you all so much for listening and tuning in this week. I hope you learned something and took something away from this. This is a very emotional topic. It's really heavy. It's kind of tough to discuss, to be honest with you, because, it combines this horrible human aspect. There's this religious element, and then there's, the military strategy and political element that we discussed with resupplying bases and whatnot. So it's such a complicated issue. It's very difficult to summarize it into one podcast episode, but I did my best. I hope you were able to enjoy it too. As always, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you like, not if you like what you heard. I hope you didn't like the topic today, but if you want to hear more, hit that subscribe button. You can check out our old episodes. We have merch over at www.laughtolearnpodcast.com/store. You can hit me up on social media. All the links are in the description to this podcast. Tell your friends and family about it. Let everyone know where you get your informations from. And as always, keep washing your hands. Keep social distancing. Keep getting those shots. Oh, we might be getting booster shots in Canada. That came out this week as well. So if you are immunocompromised, go keep getting those, or start getting those booster shots. Keep on laughing and keep on learning.